She didn't knock. She rode straight to his barn, dismounted before the horse fully stopped. Walked up to Ethan Caldwell with dust on her boots and fire in her eyes, and said it like she'd already decided the answer for both of them. "Marry me, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan's hands went still. The rope he'd been coiling dropped to the dirt. He stared at Clara Whitmore, the woman every man in Willow Creek had wanted, and none had won standing in his yard like she belonged there, and he had absolutely nothing to say. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the very end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Montana Territory, summer of 1886. Ethan Caldwell had not spoken to a woman in 11 days. He knew this because he had stopped counting after the first week, and then started again when he realized he was losing track of time. The way a man loses track of the stars, not from carelessness, but from not looking up anymore. He was not a miserable man. He would have pushed back hard against anyone who called him that. He had his cattle. He had 3 good horses. He had a well that never went dry, a barn that didn't leak, and a stretch of land in the Bitterroot Valley that turned gold every September in a way that could still catch him off guard when he wasn't paying attention. He had a life. It simply didn't have anyone else in it. That was fine. That had been fine for 12 years, and Ethan saw no compelling reason to disturb a system that worked. He woke before the sun. He worked until his shoulders ached. He cooked simple meals over a fire that crackled just loud enough to fill the quiet without replacing it. He slept without dreaming, and when morning came, he did it all again. This was what contentment looked like, he had decided. Not happiness exactly, but something steadier, something that didn't leave. He had stopped believing in the other kind. The afternoon Clara Whitmore rode up his road. Ethan was working inside the barn. He heard the hooves on the dry ground before he saw anything, a single horse moving with purpose, not drifting. He stepped to the barn door and looked out. A woman on a chestnut mare. His first thought was practical. Someone had a problem in town. A fence down on a neighboring property. A question about water rights. Something a rancher might need to answer. He wiped his hands on his work pants and stepped outside. Then the horse slowed, and he saw who was riding it. He stopped walking. Clara Whitmore was not someone you forgot. The entire town of Willow Creek carried an opinion about her the way they carried opinions about the weather constantly and with great feeling. She was 28 years old and the daughter of Thomas Whitmore, who had operated the largest dry goods enterprise in the territory before illness took him 2 winters past. She was spoken of in the same breath as words like rare and refined, and too good for most men, which was something people said admiringly, but also as a quiet warning to her and to themselves. 3 different men had tried to court her formally in the past 2 years. Charles Whitaker, who owned the 2nd largest cattle operation in the county. Gerald Foss, whose family had money from silver mining. A lawyer from Helena, whose name Ethan could never remember because he'd never particularly cared. None of them had gotten past her front porch, and yet here she was, riding alone. Down the 7 miles of rough road between Willow Creek and the edge of Ethan's property. On a Tuesday afternoon. She pulled up short of the barn, swung down from the saddle in a single smooth motion, and tied the mare to the post by the fence. She was wearing a practical riding dress, dark blue, and she'd pinned her hair back, simply without fuss. There was dust on her skirt and her gloves. She hadn't ridden easy. She walked toward him. Ethan found himself standing very still. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Miss Whitmore." His voice came out careful. "Is something wrong in town?" "Nothing's wrong." She stopped about 6 feet away from him, far enough to be proper, close enough that he could see her clearly. She wasn't nervous. That was the first thing he noticed. Her hands weren't fidgeting. Her eyes weren't darting. She was looking at him the way a person looks at something they've considered from every angle and already made peace with. "Then what brings you out this way?" Clara lifted her chin slightly. Not arrogance, something else. Resolve. "I came to ask you something, Mr. Caldwell, and I'd appreciate it if you'd hear the whole question before you answer." "All right." She took one breath, just one. "I'd like you to marry me." The afternoon went absolutely silent. Somewhere behind him, one of his horses shifted in the stall. The wind moved through the dry grass at the edge of the property. Ethan heard his own heartbeat, which seemed louder than it should have been. He said, "I beg your pardon. I know how it sounds," Clara said, and her voice didn't waver at all. "I know this isn't the way things are done. I know what people will say when they find out I rode out here. I know every single objection you're about to make, and I want you to know I've already made all of them to myself." She paused. "I'm still here." Ethan stared at her. He was not a man who got confused easily. He had handled cattle panics and flash floods and a barn fire that had nearly taken everything he had. He kept his head in difficult situations. People in Willow Creek said Ethan Caldwell was steady as a fence post and twice as reliable. Right now, Ethan Caldwell did not feel steady. "Come inside," he said finally. "Out of the sun." His kitchen table was old pine scarred from years of use with a ring burned into one corner from a coffee pot he'd set down carelessly years ago. He hadn't thought much about the table in a long time. Now, watching Clara Whitmore sit down across from it with her gloves folded in her lap, he noticed every scratch. He put coffee on without asking whether she wanted it. It gave him something to do with his hands. "You should know," he said, keeping his back to her while the pot heated, "that I'm going to need you to explain this to me, because what I think I heard doesn't make any sense." "What did you think you heard?" He turned around. "I heard the most admired woman in Willow Creek ride 7 miles of bad road to ask a man she's never spoken more than a dozen words to if he'd be willing to marry her. That's exactly what happened." "So help me understand why." Clara was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. There was a difference, and Ethan was beginning to notice that with her the difference mattered. "How long have you lived out here alone?" she asked. 12 years. "Do you know why people in town feel sorry for you?" That landed differently than he expected. He kept his expression neutral. "I imagine. They think you're lonely because nobody wanted you." She said it simply without cruelty. "They think you're out here because you had no other choice, that you're the kind of man life passed by. And what do you think? I think you're out here because you chose it." She met his eyes. "Because after you lost Eleanor, you decided that needing someone was a liability, and you've been so careful about protecting yourself from that liability that you've turned your whole life into a fortress." The coffee pot was boiling. He didn't move to take it off. "You know about Eleanor," he said. "Everyone knows the outline. Not many people understood what it meant to you." She folded her hands on the table. "I think I do." Ethan pulled the pot off the heat. His hands were steady. He made sure of it. "You came a long way to tell me things about myself. I came a long way to make you an offer." Clara's voice was even. "I don't need to be rescued, Mr. Caldwell. I'm not in a desperate situation. I have choices. I want you to understand that before I explain anything else, because I don't want you to feel like you're doing someone a favor." He poured the coffee, set one cup in front of her, kept one for himself, sat down across the table. "All right," he said. "Then tell me what you actually want." The story came out in the same way Clara seemed to do everything directly, without performance, letting the facts carry their own weight. Her father had died 18 months ago. Most people in town knew that. What most people didn't know, what Clara had kept carefully to herself, was the condition he'd left behind. Thomas Whitmore had been a good man and a poor businessman, which was a combination that produced very specific kinds of trouble. He had borrowed against the store 3 times in the last 4 years of his life. He had made 2 bad investments in mining ventures that never produced anything. He had paid wages faithfully to people who needed them even when his own accounts were empty. The result was a debt that Clara had been slowly working against for 18 months, managing the store alone, handling creditors who were patient, but not infinitely so, keeping the books in a way that her father never had. She was good at it. That wasn't the problem. The problem was Harlan Voss. Ethan knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Harlan Voss was a land broker out of Missoula who had spent the last 5 years making himself indispensable to struggling ranchers and merchants across 3 counties. He found people in trouble. He offered solutions, and the solutions always eventually meant that Harlan Voss ended up with something he hadn't owned before. He came to me 6 weeks ago, Clara said. Very polite, very reasonable. He said he'd heard about my father's debts, though I never told a soul, so that tells you something about him right there, and he wanted to help. What kind of help? He wanted to buy the building, the store property. He'd clear the debts and give me a percentage of the proceeds, and I'd have a clean start. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. He presented it as generosity. But the building has been in my family for 22 years. My grandfather built it. The land it sits on is the most valuable commercial parcel on Main Street, and Voss knows it. He's been trying to acquire that block for 3 years. Buying it from me at distressed prices would be the best deal he's ever made. Ethan was quiet. And if you refuse him, he asked, then he finds another way. Clara's voice was flat. He's already spoken to 2 of my creditors, suggested that they might want to call their notes earlier than planned. Suggested that a woman running a business alone might not be the most reliable long-term investment. She paused. He's patient. He'll keep working at it until something gives. So you need someone to stand between you and Voss? No. She said it firmly. I need a partner who brings something to this situation that I can't provide for myself. She looked at him steadily. Voss won't push against a man who has land and standing in this community. Not openly. He works on vulnerable targets. The moment I have a husband, a real one with a real stake in what happens to that property, the calculation changes. You need legal protection. I need a marriage that makes the pressure stop. She set the cup down. In return, I'll bring the store, when the debts are cleared, and I will clear them. Mr. Caldwell, I want to be very clear about that the building and the property are significant. I'm not coming to you empty-handed. Ethan leaned back in his chair. He had expected a lot of things from this conversation. This was not any of them. Miss Whitmore, he said carefully, what you're describing sounds like a business arrangement. It is. Those don't usually end well. Plenty of marriages that started as something else have ended worse. She held his gaze. I'm not asking for a fairy tale. I'm asking for honesty. Respect. Someone willing to stand beside me and work hard and not pretend we're something we're not. She paused. You're the only person I know who I genuinely believe is capable of that. You don't know me. I know more than you think. Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but opening. I've watched you for 3 years, Mr. Caldwell. Not in a strange way. Just noticed. The way you handle yourself. The way you treat people who can't do anything for you in return. She looked down at the table for a moment. Last winter. Do you remember the Patterson boy, young Billy Patterson, whose father lost 2 fingers to frostbite? Ethan remembered. You spent a full week helping them put in a proper shelter for their livestock, Clara said. You didn't tell anyone. You didn't let Tom Patterson make a fuss about it. You just showed up every morning and worked until it was done, and then you went home. She looked back up. Someone who does that when no one's watching is someone I can trust. The silence stretched out between them. Ethan had not thought about the Patterson place in months. He hadn't thought of it as anything remarkable at the time, just something that needed doing for people who couldn't manage it alone. How did you know about that? He asked. Billy told me. He came into the store for peppermint sticks in February, and he couldn't stop talking about the man who'd fixed their barn. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. He said you taught him how to hammer a nail straight. He practiced on every piece of wood he could find for a week afterward. Ethan felt something move in his chest that he didn't quite have a name for. He looked down at his coffee. I'll be honest with you about something, he said after a while. Please. When Eleanor died, I made myself a promise. He kept his voice level. I promised myself I wouldn't make the mistake of wanting things I couldn't keep. I've held to that for 12 years. He looked up at her. What you're proposing would break that promise. Clara didn't look away. Wanting isn't the same as keeping. You can want things that last. I used to think so. What changed your mind? He was quiet for a long moment. Watching something you built disappear in 3 days. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. It teaches you not to build things you can't afford to lose. I'm not asking you to build something you can't afford. Her voice was careful now, thoughtful. I'm asking you to enter into an arrangement that has clearly defined boundaries and mutual benefit. What happens after that? She paused. That's not something either of us needs to commit to right now. He looked at her. She looked back. You really thought all of this through, he said. I've been thinking about it for 3 months. No apology in her voice, just the plain fact. I made a list of every man in this county who I believed was honest, capable, and not motivated by the wrong things. The list was short. Your name was at the top. She tilted her head slightly. I can tell you the others if it would help you feel less singled out. Despite everything, Ethan almost smiled. That won't be necessary, he said. He asked her to come back the next morning. He needed to sleep on it, he said. He needed to think without the weight of her eyes and her calm, relentless logic pressing down on him. Clara agreed without argument. She stood, gathered her gloves, and said she'd be there by 9. He walked her to the mare, held the horse while she mounted, and then before she rode away, she looked down at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. For what it's worth, she said. I know this isn't what you expected today. It's not what I expected, he confirmed. I know it's a lot to carry overnight. She gathered the reins. But I want you to know something. I didn't come to you because I was desperate. I came to you because out of everyone I considered, you were the one I actually thought I could... She stopped, looked for the word. Build something with. Whatever that something turns out to be. She rode away before he could answer. He stood in the yard and watched her go until the dust settled back down on the road. Then he went back inside his empty house, sat down at the old pine table, and stared at the 2 coffee cups still sitting there. He hadn't had 2 coffee cups on that table at the same time in 12 years. He sat there for a long time, not moving. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark and turned her words over in his mind, the way you turn a stone in your hands, looking for the flaw, the crack, the place where the whole thing would split apart if you pressed too hard. He found things to argue with. It was a transaction dressed in reasonable language. People would talk. People would assume the worst about her judgment and his motives and the whole arrangement, and they would say so loudly and repeatedly. His life was organized around its quiet, and inviting Clara Whitmore into it would end that quiet immediately and permanently. He found things he couldn't argue with. He'd watched Harlan Voss operate. He knew what the man was. And the picture Clara had drawn, a woman alone managing inherited debt, being slowly surrounded by a man who specialized in isolation and pressure, that picture was real. That wasn't desperation performing a strategy. That was a clear-eyed person assessing her situation and making the best move available to her, and she'd said his name was at the top of the list. He didn't know what to do with that. He'd stopped thinking of himself as someone anyone would choose. Not from self-pity, he would have rejected that framing immediately, but from a kind of pragmatic acceptance. He was what he was. He had what he had. He did not fit into the shape that most women wanted. Clara Whitmore had looked at exactly what he was and ridden 7 miles to ask for it specifically. He was still awake at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling. At some point, without deciding to, he thought about Billy Patterson, a 12-year-old boy practicing hammering nails because a man had shown him how. He thought about the way Clara had said it not to flatter him, just to explain how she'd come to know something about him he'd never thought to tell anyone. She'd been paying attention. For 3 years she'd been paying attention, and she'd seen something worth riding 7 miles to find. He didn't know what that meant yet, but at 4 in the morning, still sleepless, he admitted to himself that he was going to say yes. She arrived at 9 exactly. Ethan was standing in the yard when she came up the road. He'd been there for 10 minutes, which was something he chose not to examine too closely. Clara dismounted, tied the mare, walked toward him. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him and waited. And the waiting itself was somehow respectful, like she understood that whatever he'd arrived at had cost him something, and she wasn't going to rush the delivery. "I have conditions," Ethan said. Clara nodded. "Tell me." "This is an agreement between equals. You don't need my permission to run your business, and I don't need your opinion on how I run mine. We operate as partners in shared things and separately in everything else." "Agreed." "No pretending to the world that this is something it isn't. We don't put on a show." "I don't want a show," she said. "That's never been what I wanted." He looked at her carefully. "And Voss?" "I want to deal with Voss directly. I want to know everything you know about him, the creditors he's spoken to, the timing, all of it. I don't walk into things blind. I'll tell you everything tonight." "Good." He paused. "One more thing. Name it. If you change your mind at any point for any reason, you tell me directly. No managing around it, no pretending. You tell me, and we figure out something else." He met her eyes. "That works both ways. This has to stay honest, or it doesn't work at all." Clara was quiet for a moment, then she extended her hand. "Those are my conditions too," she said. "All of them." Ethan looked at her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm, and standing in the yard of the ranch he'd run alone for 12 years. Ethan Caldwell made the first decision in a very long time that he had absolutely no idea how to prepare for. Neither of them noticed the rider on the hill at the edge of the property, watching unmoving before turning his horse slowly and heading back toward Willow Creek. They would notice him later. By then it would already be too late to change what was coming. The rider on the hill had a name. Ethan found out 3 days later, and the name didn't surprise him. It was Roy Decker, one of Harlan Voss's men. A quiet, watchful type who showed up wherever Voss needed eyes and never seemed to have business of his own. Ethan had seen him twice before in Willow Creek, always at the edges of things, always leaving a room slightly before anyone thought to ask why he'd been there. Someone had seen Roy on the hill. One of Ethan's neighbors, a cattleman named Frank Purdy, whose property ran along the east side of the road, had spotted the rider that morning and mentioned it later in passing. The way men in that country mention things casually, as information, rather than alarm. But Frank Purdy knew Roy Decker the same way everyone in 3 counties knew him. And Frank Purdy knew what it meant when Roy Decker was watching something. He told Ethan. Ethan said nothing to Clara that evening. He wanted to understand what he was dealing with before he said anything. He had promised her honesty, and he intended to keep that. But there was a difference between honesty and alarm, and he wasn't ready to create the second without more information than he currently had. Instead, he rode into Willow Creek the following morning and paid a visit to the county recorder's office. What he found there changed the shape of the problem entirely. The Whitmore property, the store building, and the land beneath it had a clean deed going back to 1864. Thomas Whitmore had purchased it, legitimately built on it, and left it to Clara without encumbrance. The building was hers outright. But the notes, the debts against the inventory, and the operating accounts, those were a different matter. 2 of the 3 creditors Clara had mentioned were local men. Reasonable men. The kind who would work with a borrower in good faith, because they understood that business had seasons, and a difficult year didn't make a person untrustworthy. The third was a lending firm out of Missoula. Ethan recognized the address on the paperwork before he recognized the name on it. The address was the same building where Harlan Voss kept his offices. He sat with that for a moment. Let it settle. Then he asked the recorder, a dry, efficient man named George Alcott, who had worked that office for 20 years and kept his opinions to himself, whether there had been any recent inquiries on the Whitmore parcel. George Alcott looked at his ledger. 3 inquiries in the past 8 weeks, he said. All different names, all came in separately. Same handwriting on the request forms? George Alcott looked at the forms. He looked at Ethan. He said nothing, which was itself an answer. Ethan thanked him and rode back to the ranch. He had a clear picture now. Voss wasn't just pressuring Clara through social channels. He had positioned himself inside her debt structure. The lending firm in Missoula almost certainly held the note he could move on first if he chose to. The separate inquiries at the recorder's office were reconnaissance mapping the legal landscape, looking for any weakness in the deed history, any gap he could use. This was not opportunism. This was a campaign, and it had been running for longer than Clara knew. He told her that evening. She had been at the ranch for 2 days by then, not living there yet, but coming each morning and staying through the late afternoon, learning the property, the way she did everything systematically and without wasted motion. She'd already reorganized his supply ledger, which he hadn't asked her to do, and when he raised an eyebrow at it, she told him it had been wrong by about $40 for at least 6 months, and he was welcome to put it back the way it was. He had not put it back. She was sitting at the kitchen table, going through a set of accounts from the store, when he came in from Willow Creek. He put his hat on the hook by the door, poured water, turned around. "I went to the recorder's office today," he said. Clara looked up. Something shifted in her expression, not fear, but attention. The sharp kind. "And," he told her, "all of it. The Missoula firm, the address, the 3 inquiries filed under different names." He laid it out plainly and without commentary, because she didn't need him to interpret it for her. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't know about the lending firm," she said. "I know. I thought that note was held by a private investor out of Helena. That's what the paperwork said when my father signed it. It may have changed hands." Ethan sat down across from her. "Voss buys debt. That's part of how he operates. He finds the creditor acquires the note, and suddenly he's the one you owe. By the time you understand what happened, he's already in the room." Clara was very still. "How long ago do you think this started?" she asked. "Before your father died, if I had to guess." He watched her face. Thomas Whitmore's trouble wasn't a secret in Missoula. Men like Voss watch for that kind of thing. They're patient. She set her pen down on the table, very carefully, the kind of careful that meant she was controlling something underneath it. "He's been planning this for 2 years, she said. Not a question. Maybe longer." She was quiet. Then she said very quietly, "My father would have been devastated to know this." Ethan said nothing. Sometimes the right response was just to let a person feel what they needed to feel without rushing them through it. After a moment, Clara straightened. Her chin came up, her hands flattened on the table. "All right," she said. "What do we do?" What they did first was get married, not a ceremony that would come later, and even then it would be small and practical. What they did first was ride into Willow Creek together on a Thursday morning and sign the necessary paperwork at the territorial judge's office, with 2 witnesses pulled from the street, because in Montana in 1886, that was all it took if both parties were willing and the judge was available. Judge Harold Crane was available. He was also clearly startled, which he managed with reasonable professionalism. He had known Ethan Caldwell for 15 years and had probably made the same quiet assumption the rest of the town had made, that Ethan was finished with the parts of life that required a partner. He recovered, asked the necessary questions, received the necessary answers, and signed the necessary documents with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. When it was done, he shook Ethan's hand and said, "Congratulations, Ethan." Then he looked at Clara and said, "Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Caldwell, I hope you know what an unusual man you've chosen." Clara looked at the judge with perfect composure. "Yes," she said. "That's rather the point." They walked out of the courthouse into the main street of Willow Creek. That was when Willow Creek found out. It moved through the town with the speed that only genuine shock can produce. Within an hour, it was in the feed store, the barber shop, the 2 saloons, and the women's circle that met Thursday afternoons at the Methodist meeting hall. By midday, it had reached every household within 5 miles of Main Street. By evening, it had traveled 12 miles in 3 directions, carried by anyone who had business that took them out of town. Ethan Caldwell and Clara Whitmore, married, this morning. The reaction divided itself almost immediately into 2 camps. The first camp was surprised but willing to consider it. These were mostly people who knew Ethan well, who had watched him work for 12 years, who understood what he was made of, who believed that Clara Whitmore was a woman with good judgment and had probably applied it here. The second camp was louder. It was anchored by Charles Whitaker, who heard the news at the feed store and stood in the middle of the floor for a long moment without speaking. The man who had courted Clara Whitmore formally, who had called on her with flowers and letters, and had been politely but unmistakably declined, did not take the news quietly. "She chose Ethan Caldwell," he said to no one in particular. No one said anything. "A man who has barely spoken to anyone in a decade," Whitaker continued. His voice was level, but there was something under it that the other men in the store heard clearly. "A man whose ranch is half the size of mine with no staff, no standing. He's got good cattle," someone offered. Whitaker looked at the speaker. The speaker found something else to look at. "Something is wrong with this picture," Whitaker said. "That's all I'm saying. Something about this is not what it appears." He walked out. The men who remained in the feed store looked at each other and said nothing, because what Whitaker had just said could be interpreted charitably as concern and uncharitably as something else, and nobody wanted to commit to either reading until they understood the situation better. The situation became clearer and more complicated within 48 hours. Harlan Voss rode into Willow Creek on a Saturday. He was a tall man, slim with close-cut gray hair, and the kind of careful, pleasant face that was designed to make you feel at ease around him. He wore good clothes without being flashy about it. He was polite to everyone he spoke to. He had never in anyone's recollection raised his voice. He was also one of the most dangerous men in 3 counties, and the people who understood it the way you understand certain weather by what it leaves behind, rather than what it looks like while it's happening. He came to the ranch. Ethan had been expecting it. He was in the yard when Voss rode up because he had made a point of being visible, a deliberate choice. He did not want their first conversation to happen on Voss's terms in a place Voss had chosen. He wanted Voss to come to him and find him standing on his own ground waiting. Voss dismounted. He looked at the property with an expression that managed to be simultaneously admiring and appraising, as if everything he saw was something he was already filing away for later. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "congratulations on your marriage." Voss: "I hope you won't take offense at a neighbor coming to offer his regards." He walked toward Ethan with easy confidence, the walk of a man who had never been turned away from a door in his life. "I've been meaning to introduce myself properly for some time." "You've introduced yourself," Ethan said, "to 2 of my wife's creditors, and you've had a man watching this property." He kept his voice even. "That's an introduction of a kind." Voss stopped. For just a moment, just one beat, something moved behind his pleasant expression. Then the pleasantness reassembled itself, and he smiled. "You're direct," he said. "I respect that. I'm clear," Ethan said. "There's a difference. Clear means I'll say the same thing twice if I need to, and I won't apologize for it." Voss studied him. "Then I'll be equally clear. Your wife has outstanding debt, some of which I hold. That's a business matter, not a personal one. I'd welcome the opportunity to discuss a settlement that benefits everyone involved." "My wife manages her own accounts," Ethan said. "Any conversation about settlement happens with both of us present in writing with our own legal representation reviewing the terms." Something flickered in Voss's face again. Faster this time. Gone just as quickly. "Of course," he said smoothly. "That's entirely reasonable." "Good." Ethan didn't move from where he was standing. "Then you'll wait until we contact you. We'll arrange the meeting when we're ready." A long pause. Voss nodded slowly. "I'll look forward to it," he said. He mounted his horse and rode away. Ethan watched him go. His hands were loose at his sides, and his breathing was controlled. From the outside, he looked like a man who had just had a pleasant, if uneventful, conversation. Inside, he was moving fast, running through everything Voss had just given him: the timing, the tone, the specific words. A man like Voss didn't say anything accidentally. Every sentence was designed. And Voss had offered settlement without being asked, which meant one of two things: either he wanted this resolved cleanly, or he wanted to see what they knew before he decided on his next move. Ethan went inside and told Clara what had happened. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "He came to see if we were going to fold." "That's what I think. He expected me to be managing a frightened woman. Instead, he found you." She said it matter-of-factly, without drama. "That changes his arithmetic." "Some of it." Ethan sat down. "But not all. He still holds that note from Missoula. That's real leverage regardless of anything else." Clara opened the folder she'd been working from. "I've been looking at the note terms. There's a provision in the original language from when my father signed it before it changed hands that requires 60 days written notice before any acceleration. Voss can't call it immediately. He has to give us time." She looked up. "Which means we have time." Ethan looked at the papers. "How did you find that?" "I read everything twice." She said it simply. "And then I read it again." He looked at her for a moment. "We need a lawyer," he said. "I have one in mind. A man named Theodore Marsh. He's in Helena, but he's worked territorial land cases before. He knows the relevant statutes." She paused. "He's also someone Harlan Voss has encountered in court, and from what I understand didn't particularly enjoy the experience." "You already contacted him." "I wrote to him last week." She met his eyes. "I told you I'd been thinking about this for 3 months. Theodore Marsh has been thinking about it for 2 of them." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara." "Yes." "When did you sleep?" She blinked. Then, unexpectedly, briefly, she almost smiled. "Thursday. I sleep on Thursdays." He looked at her. He did not smile exactly, but something in his face changed slightly, a loosening maybe. Something that had been braced for a long time, easing just a fraction. "All right," he said. "Tell me about Marsh." What happened next came from a direction neither of them anticipated. The following Tuesday, Ethan was in town to pick up hardware supplies. He had finished at the merchant's and was crossing the street when a woman's voice caught his attention. Sharp, carrying the kind of voice that was used to holding a room. Margaret Hale. She was one of the most prominent women in Willow Creek, the wife of the bank president, and she had been Clara Whitmore's most vocal social advocate since Clara's father died. She was also, Ethan had always suspected, a woman who enjoyed knowing things, and chose her friendships accordingly. She was standing in front of the millinery, talking to 2 other women, and she did not lower her voice when she said what she said next. "I heard Clara moved to the Caldwell ranch," Margaret Hale announced, in the tone of someone delivering a verdict. "I hope she knows what she's doing. That man has been alone so long he probably doesn't know how to carry on a decent conversation." One of the other women murmured something. "I'm not saying he's a bad man," Margaret continued. "I'm saying Clara could have had anyone. Charles Whitaker called on her properly, a lawyer from Helena, and she chose," she gestured vaguely, "this." Ethan had stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the street, holding his hardware bag close enough that Margaret Hale would have to be genuinely oblivious not to notice him. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to do with this. He had never been a man who carried on public arguments. His preference was to let the world talk and focus on the work. But something settled in him differently now. A clarity. Because it wasn't about him. He didn't care what Margaret Hale thought of him. It was about Clara. He turned and walked directly toward the 3 women. Margaret Hale saw him coming. Her voice stopped mid-sentence. He stopped a polite distance away and said, "Mrs. Hale." She recovered quickly. "Mr. Caldwell, I didn't realize. I heard what you said." He kept his voice quiet, not hostile, Just honest. I understand people have opinions. That's their right. He paused. But my wife is one of the most capable people I have ever encountered, and the choice she made was made with full information and clear judgment. I'd appreciate it if the town extended her the same respect it always has. He looked at her steadily. She hasn't changed. The situation around her has. People might think about what that means before they choose their words. Silence. Margaret Hale opened her mouth, closed it. Ethan nodded to the three of them, turned and continued across the street. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. He got to the other side, kept walking, and did not look back. Behind him, he heard nothing for a long moment. Then Margaret Hale said in a different tone entirely, "Well, I suppose that's something." He didn't tell Clara about it immediately. He told her that evening because the honesty condition ran in both directions, and he'd decided it meant the small things, as well as the large ones. He told it simply without performing it, just what had been said, and what he had said back. Clara listened. When he finished, she didn't say anything right away. She looked out the window for a moment, and when she looked back, her expression was one that Ethan had not seen from her before. Not the careful, composed face she wore when she was working through a problem. Something quieter than that. Something that was working through something else entirely. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. It will make some people more suspicious about our arrangement, not less. They'll think you're performing. Maybe." He shrugged slightly. But it needed to be said. She looked at him. "Why?" she asked. And it was a real question, not a challenge. She genuinely wanted to understand. Ethan thought about it. He didn't answer quickly. "Because you built something worth defending," he said finally. "And you built it mostly alone, and you didn't complain about that. So when someone reduces it to a question of which man you should have chosen..." He stopped. "That's not what the story is about." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara said after a long moment, "You're going to make this complicated for me." "I'll try to be clear about it," he said. "That's not what I mean." She looked down at her hands. "I mean, I told myself this was practical. An arrangement. I was very logical about it." She looked back up. "You defended my name in the street when you didn't have to and without making a performance of it. That's..." She stopped. "That's the kind of thing that makes practical arrangements harder to keep practical." He didn't know what to say to that. He didn't say anything. But something shifted between them in that kitchen. Something small and real, in the way that things shift when people stop performing for each other, even slightly. The letter from Theodore Marsh arrived 6 days later. Ethan was out when it came. Clara read it at the kitchen table, and by the time he came in from the barn, she had read it 3 times, and was sitting with her hands flat on the table, and her face doing the thing it did when she was keeping something contained. He closed the door. "What does it say?" She looked up. "He found something." "Tell me." "The note Voss holds the one from the Missoula firm. Marsh found the original instrument." She slid the letter across the table. "The transfer from the Helena investor to the Missoula firm was never properly recorded. Under territorial statute, a debt instrument that transfers hands without proper recording within 90 days is unenforceable in a territorial court." She paused. "Voss doesn't just hold a weak note, Ethan. He may hold no note at all." Silence. Ethan looked at the letter. "Marsh is certain of this?" he asked. "He says he's confident, but wants to verify one more document. He needs a copy of the original filing date from the recorder's office." She met his eyes. "The same recorder's office you visited 2 weeks ago." He was already thinking. "George Alcott. Can you get that document?" "I can ask for it." He straightened. "Alcott's careful. He'll want to understand why. Then tell him why." She looked at him steadily. "Ethan, if Marsh is right, Voss has no legal standing. The pressure he's been applying, the implied threat of calling the note, it's all built on something that doesn't hold up." She spread her hands. "He's been running a bluff." He may not know that, Ethan said. Or he may know it and be counting on us not finding out. Either way, we found out. Her voice was steady. Now what do we do with it? Ethan sat down across the table. He looked at the letter. He looked at Clara. And he said something he had not said in a very long time, not because it was difficult, but because for 12 years there had been nobody to say it to. We go on offense, he said. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Good. And there it was again, that thing between them that was not yet named, but was clearly not nothing growing quietly in the space where a practical arrangement had been taking up room that neither of them had planned to offer it. Outside, the September light was going gold across the valley. Neither of them mentioned it. But neither of them moved to light the lamps for a long time, either sitting in the kitchen, as the light changed, going over Marsh's letter line by line, their voices quiet and steady, and together. George Alcott found the document in 11 minutes. Ethan had not expected it to be fast. He had expected resistance, or at least the particular kind of bureaucratic caution that made a man like Alcott ask 3 questions before answering one. But when Ethan walked into the recorder's office and laid out the situation plainly, not all of it just enough, Alcott had gone to his files without a word and come back with a folder that he set on the counter between them. Original filing date, Alcott said. Stamped and witnessed. He paused. I noticed something about this one when it came through. The paperwork was right, but the timing felt off. Didn't have cause to raise it then. He looked at Ethan. Sounds like cause has arrived. Ethan looked at the stamp. The transfer had been filed 107 days after the original instrument changed hands. Territorial statute required 90, 17 days late. On its face, a minor administrative oversight. In a territorial courtroom, potentially fatal to the enforceability of the debt. I'll need a certified copy, Ethan said. Alcott was already reaching for his stamp. Ethan rode back to the ranch with the document inside his coat. He kept his horse at a steady pace rather than pushing it because arriving in a controlled state mattered more than arriving fast. He had learned that a long time ago. Rush makes you sloppy, sloppy makes you vulnerable, and right now he could not afford either. Clara was at the table with Marsh's letter when he came through the door. He put the certified copy in front of her. She read the filing date, read it again. Then she set it beside the letter and aligned the edges very precisely the way she did when she was managing the feeling underneath something. It matches, she said. It matches. She took a breath. Ethan, this means Voss has been leveraging a debt he cannot legally collect. Possibly. He sat down. Marsh still needs to verify it against the territorial statute in court. This doesn't end it, but it changes the position. How soon can we get this to Marsh? I'll have it on the morning stage to Helena. Clara nodded. Then she looked up from the papers, and something moved across her face that Ethan had not seen before. Not relief, not satisfaction, but something rawer than either. Something that looked like the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding a weight alone for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down, but doesn't quite believe it yet. My father didn't know what he signed? She said quietly. He trusted that note. He thought it was a straightforward private loan. I know. He would have been so ashamed if he'd understood what it actually was. He didn't sign it to Voss, Ethan said. He signed it to someone who appeared to be a legitimate creditor. What happened after wasn't his doing. He paused. That matters. Clara looked at him. You say things like that, she said. Like they're obvious. Aren't they? Not to most people. Most people would say he should have been more careful. Most people haven't tried to run a business with no margin for error while they were dying. He said it without softness, because softness would have felt condescending. Just the fact stated plainly. Your father did his best with what he had. That's what I see. Clara didn't answer for a long moment. When she did, her voice was careful in the way voices get when something inside is close to the surface. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Tell me what else we need before Marsh can move. She picked up the letter. Back to work. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. It settled somewhere in the room like something real that had been named. Dened. The document went on the morning stage. 2 days later, Harlan Voss made his second move. It didn't come from Voss directly. That wasn't how he operated. It came through Charles Whitaker, which was the part that surprised Ethan when he first heard it, and then didn't surprise him at all when he thought about it for 10 more seconds. Whitaker approached Clara in town. She had gone in to check on the store. She was still managing it, still keeping it running while the legal situation developed, and Whitaker was waiting when she came out. Not lurking. Standing in plain sight, which was somehow worse, because it meant he wanted witnesses. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, using her married name with an inflection that suggested it tasted strange in his mouth. "Mr. Whitaker." Clara kept walking. He fell into step beside her. "I hope you'll give me a moment." "I have a moment." She did not slow down. "I've heard some things about your situation," he said. "About Voss, about the debt arrangements." He kept his voice low, which was courteous, and which also meant the people nearby had to strain to hear them, which they did. "I want you to know that I could help. Whatever Caldwell can offer, I can offer more. The resources to clear those debts cleanly without the legal complication." Clara stopped. Whitaker stopped. She turned and looked at him with an expression that Ethan later, when she told him about it, would have given considerable money to have seen. "Mr. Whitaker," she said clearly, "let me make sure I understand you. You're offering to manage my financial situation. In exchange for what exactly?" Whitaker's face colored slightly. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant." Her voice was pleasant and absolutely immovable. "You've decided that because my situation is complicated, I might be willing to revisit a decision I made with full information and clear judgment. You're wrong." She looked at him steadily. "And I'll tell you something else. Whatever you've heard about our situation, you heard it from someone who wanted you to hear it. I'd think carefully about who benefits from you inserting yourself into this before you say anything else." Whitaker stared at her. The two women who had been near enough to hear this found something very interesting to look at on the other side of the street. Whitaker said stiffly, "I was offering help." "You were offering leverage," Clara said. "There's a difference, and I've had enough practice with that distinction recently that I can spot it quickly." She nodded to him. "Good day, Mr. Whitaker." She walked away. When she told Ethan that evening, he listened to the whole thing without commenting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He mentioned the debt specifically," Ethan said. "Yes." "He said he'd heard about the debt arrangements." Clara looked at him. "You think Voss told him?" "I think Voss gave him just enough to make him useful." He turned the idea over. "Whitaker goes to you. You either take the offer which gets you out from under Voss's leverage, but puts you under Whitaker's, or you refuse, which Voss expects you to do, and then Whitaker becomes annoyed and starts talking publicly about how complicated your situation is." Clara was very still. "And public doubt about the store's finances makes the creditors nervous, which puts pressure on the notes without Voss having to do anything himself." She let out a slow breath. "He's using Whitaker as a tool without Whitaker understanding it." "Whitaker understands some of it," Ethan said. "He's not stupid. He just thinks he's running his own play." He paused. "That's the most dangerous kind of person to have in the situation. Not evil, just self-interested enough to do damage without meaning to." Clara was quiet for the moment thinking. Then she said, "We need to move faster than we planned." "I know. If Voss is escalating, if he's now involving Whitaker, he's not going to wait for us to organize a legal response. He's going to put pressure on the situation from multiple sides until something breaks." "Then we need to give him less time," Ethan said. "I'm going to write to Marsh tonight, tell him what happened, ask him to move up the timetable. There's something else we need to consider." Clara looked at him. "The store. As long as it's showing stress creditor uncertainty reduced traffic, it supports Voss's narrative that the property is distressed. We need to stabilize it visibly, not just financially, publicly. What does that look like? We open it properly, full stock, Regular hours. I stop managing it like I'm protecting something fragile and start running it like I'm expanding something healthy. She spread her hands. The story needs to change. Not in the papers in the street. In the way people see it when they walk past. Ethan thought about that. That takes money we're holding in reserve. Some of it. Not all. She met his eyes. I know what I'm doing with accounts, Ethan. I'm not suggesting we risk the reserve. I'm suggesting we use the portion we can afford to reframe the narrative while Marsh does his work. She paused. This is what I know. This is what I'm good at. Let me do it. He looked at her. All right, he said. Something passed between them. Not grand, just mutual. Two people who had agreed to operate as partners discovering what it actually felt like when that meant trusting the other person's competence in their own territory. Write to Marsh tonight, she said, already standing. I'll have a plan for the store by morning. He didn't doubt for a second that she would. Marsh wrote back in 4 days. The letter was 3 pages dense with legal language that Ethan read twice and Clara read once and explained back to him in a quarter of the time. Theodore Marsh was confident, more than confident. He had pulled the territorial statute and cross-referenced it against 2 prior cases in the territory, both of which had ruled in the same direction. An unrecorded debt transfer made the instrument unenforceable as written. Voss could challenge it, but a challenge would require him to appear before a territorial judge and explain the filing delay and the explanation available to him. Administrative oversight was the same explanation that had failed in both prior cases. In short, Voss's leverage was built on sand. He wants to proceed, Clara said, looking up from the letter. He wants authorization to contact Voss, formally inform him of the statute issue, and offer him a choice release the note in exchange for no legal action or defend the instrument in court. What does Marsh think he'll do? Release it. She set the letter down. Marsh says men like Voss don't fight battles they know they've already lost. They find the exit that lets them preserve their reputation and move on to the next target. She paused. But he says Voss will need to believe we'll actually follow through on the court option. He'll probe first. Let him probe, Ethan said. Clara authorized Marsh in writing that afternoon. They sent the letter on the evening stage, and then they waited, which was the hardest part of any of it, because waiting meant the pressure of the unknown, and the unknown had a way of filling whatever space you gave it. What filled the space, as it turned out, was the drought. It had been building for 3 weeks, announced first, in the way the grass dried earlier than usual, and the creek running along the north edge of the property dropped half a foot lower than it should have been for September. Ethan had seen it coming and said nothing to Clara, because he was used to carrying weather concerns alone, and also because they had enough on their hands without adding weather. But by the 3rd week of September, it was undeniable, and he sat down with Clara and told her plainly what he was looking at. The cattle needed water. The North Creek was down. The main stock pond was holding, but if they didn't get rain in the next 3 weeks, he would need to make decisions about the herd, which cattle to hold, which to move, whether to sell at a reduced price now, or gamble on rain. Clara listened to the whole thing. Then she said, "Show me the accounts." He brought them. She went through them with the same systematic attention she gave everything, cross-referencing the cattle numbers against the feed costs and water hauling estimates and market prices he had from the last 3 months of trading. She didn't speak for 40 minutes. Then she said, "You have 40 head you could move right now at 70% of market value, and it would cover the water hauling costs for 8 weeks. If it rains in that window, you lose nothing meaningful. If it doesn't, you've bought yourself time to make a larger decision from a position of strength rather than panic." Ethan looked at the numbers. "That's what I was thinking," he said. "Then why didn't you say so?" He paused. "I'm used to making those decisions alone," he said. "I didn't think—" He stopped. Clara looked at him steadily. "This is a partnership," she said. "Not angry, just clear. You told me your conditions on day 1. Equal standing, honest communication. That runs in both directions, I don't hide things about the store from you." "You're right," he said. "No hedging." She nodded. "Sell the 40 head. I'll handle the buyer. Contact Martin Reese at the stockyards, has always dealt fairly. You focus on the water situation." She paused. "And Ethan, next time something is building, tell me when it starts. Not when it's already a problem." "Understood." She looked at him for a moment longer, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to satisfy her, because she looked back at the accounts without saying anything else. He sat there a moment after she turned her attention back to the papers. He was trying to remember the last time someone had held him to his own standards. He couldn't remember because it had never happened. The cattle sold in 2 days. Martin Reese came out to the property, looked over the 40 head, and offered 68% of market. Clara counteroffered 72%. Reese considered it for about 4 seconds and said yes, because he knew good cattle when he saw them, and he knew what the drought was doing to supply across the county. The water hauling started the following Monday, and on Wednesday, Roy Decker appeared at the edge of the property again. Ethan saw him from the yard. Same position as before, same stillness. The kind of watching that was meant to be noticed, a message, not surveillance. Voss was letting them know he was still present, still interested, still running his own timetable, regardless of what they'd sent to Helena. Ethan looked at Decker across the distance for a long moment. Then he turned and went back inside. "Roy Decker is on the hill," he told Clara. She was at the table. She didn't look up from what she was reading. "I know. I saw him 10 minutes ago." "You didn't say anything?" "I was waiting to see what you'd do." She looked up then. "What did you do?" "Ignored him." She nodded. "Good. That's the right response. Voss is signaling that Marsh's letter hasn't scared him off. Or he's signaling that it has," Clara said, "and he wants us to get nervous and do something foolish before his next move." She set her papers down. "He's waiting for us to react. Every time we don't, we take something away from him." Ethan studied her. "You've been thinking about this. Constantly." She said it without apology. "I think about this the way you think about the herd, every angle, every contingency. What happens if this goes wrong? What happens if that does?" She met his eyes. "It's how I'm built." "It's not a complaint," he said. "I know. I'm explaining, not defending." She picked her papers back up. "Decker will be gone by sundown. Voss is testing our nerves. We passed the test by having dinner and going to sleep." Ethan almost said something about the particular absurdity of a woman who had ridden 7 miles alone to propose a marriage arrangement, now calmly advising him on psychological warfare tactics. He didn't say it, but the thought moved through him with something that felt uncomfortably close to warmth. He went out to check the water line. Decker was gone by sundown, exactly as she'd said. 3 days later, Harlan Voss made his real move, and it didn't come through Roy Decker or Charles Whitaker or any channel Ethan had been watching. It came through Clara's aunt, Dorothy Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore's sister, older by a dozen years, who had lived in Billings since before Clara was born, and had the particular energy of a woman who viewed all family matters as her personal territory, regardless of geography, arrived on the Thursday stage without warning. Clara opened the door and found her standing on the porch of the ranch house with 2 bags and an expression that suggested she had traveled a considerable distance and expected the reception to reflect that. "Aunt Dorothy," Clara said in a voice that was exactly composed enough to reveal how uncomposed she was. "Clara!" Dorothy stepped inside without being invited, which was consistent with her entire history. She looked around the kitchen, at the organized accounts on the table, at the 2 coffee cups, at Ethan standing by the stove. "You must be the cowboy." "Ethan Caldwell," Ethan said. "Ma'am." Dorothy looked at him with the focus of someone taking an inventory. She turned back to Clara. "We need to talk." Clara showed no expression. "Of course. Ethan, would you—" "I'll check the north line," he said, and took his hat from the hook. He was halfway out the door when Dorothy said, "You can stay, Mr. Caldwell. What I have to say affects you as well." He stopped. He came back. He sat down at the table. Dorothy settled herself in the chair across from Clara, with the deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at her niece. "I had a visitor last week," she said. "A man named Harlan Voss." The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Clara didn't move. "Go on." "He came to Billings specifically to see me." Dorothy's voice was careful, not unkind, but careful. "He told me he was concerned about your situation. He said he had a financial interest in some of your father's accounts, and he was worried that your recent—" She paused. "Decisions might complicate the settlement of those accounts in ways that would be harmful to you." "He said that," Clara said. "He was very polite about it." Dorothy looked at her hands. "He said that your father's debts were more significant than you'd admitted to the family. He said the property might be at risk, and he said—" She stopped again. "He said that he had spoken to a judge in Missoula about the matter, and that the judge had concerns about whether your recent marriage was contracted under appropriate circumstances." The silence was absolute. Ethan felt something move through him that was cold and controlled and very focused. Clara said very quietly, "He told you the marriage was invalid. He suggested it might be in question. He said something about the circumstances being unusual and that a judge might be interested in examining them." Dorothy looked up at her niece. "Clara, I want you to know that I didn't believe everything he said, but he was persuasive, and he had documents." "What kind of documents?" "Letters. Some of them looked like they were from your father's files." Dorothy reached into her bag and produced an envelope. "He asked me to give you these." Clara took the envelope. She opened it. She read the contents 3 pages, and she read them without her expression changing at all, which Ethan was beginning to understand was what Clara's face did when something was genuinely serious. She finished. She set the papers on the table. She looked at Ethan. "He found letters my father wrote to the Helena investor," she said, "before the note transferred. They look like my father was acknowledging the debt at a higher figure than the original instrument stated." Ethan looked at the papers. "Can he falsify those?" "He doesn't need to falsify them." Clara's voice was flat. "He needs them to be ambiguous enough to create doubt. Doubt is what he sells." She looked at her aunt. "Aunt Dorothy, tell me exactly what he said about the judge." Dorothy repeated it word for word because she was a woman with a precise memory, and she knew this mattered. Voss had mentioned a specific judge in Missoula, a territorial judge named Arthur Penner. He had implied that Penner was willing to examine the marriage on the grounds that it had been contracted in unusual circumstances that might suggest coercion or financial manipulation. Clara was quiet. Then she said, "Ethan." "I'm already thinking it," he said. "Marsh needs to know about Penner. Tonight." Dorothy looked between them. "Will someone explain to me what is actually happening?" Clara looked at her aunt. "Voss doesn't hold a valid debt instrument," she said. "His lawyer found a filing error that makes the note unenforceable in territorial court. He's known we were building a legal case, and he's decided that if he can't win on the debt, he'll try to invalidate the marriage and reopen the question of who controls the property." She paused. "He went to you because he needed someone who loves me to deliver this. Because if it came from him directly, I'd know immediately it was a threat. Coming from you, I'm supposed to feel the personal weight of it and lose my footing." Dorothy stared at her niece. "He used me," Dorothy said, flatly. "Yes." Dorothy's expression changed. It went through several things very quickly and landed somewhere that Ethan would have described in his own vocabulary as fighting ready. "What do you need from me?" Dorothy asked. Clara blinked. It was the first time Ethan had seen her genuinely surprised. "A statement," Clara said carefully. "What he told you, the specific words about Judge Penner, written and witnessed." Dorothy was already reaching for paper. Ethan got up and brought her a pen. He didn't say anything, But something in his chest had shifted, was shifting actually continuously, in the way that things shift when you stop being braced against something and start believing it might actually hold. Clara caught his eye across the table. She held his gaze for just a moment. Something passed between them that neither of them spoke about. Something that was not about Voss or the note or the impending legal confrontation in a territorial courthouse. Something quieter and more permanent than any of that. Then Dorothy said, "How do I start?" And Clara turned back to her aunt, and Ethan sat down, and the pen began to move across the paper. Outside the ranch was quiet. The North Creek was low, and the reserve was stretched, and Harlan Voss was somewhere between Billings and Missoula running his next calculation. But in the kitchen of the Caldwell ranch, 3 people sat around an old pine table, and the document that was going to change everything was being written in the clear, unhurried hand of a woman who had been underestimated by the wrong man, and the walls of everything Voss had constructed were beginning quietly and irrevocably to come apart. Dorothy's statement filled 2.5 pages. She wrote it herself in longhand with the kind of precision that comes from a woman who has spent her life managing correspondence and knows exactly what careful language looks like and exactly what sloppy language costs. She included dates. She included direct quotations where she remembered them clearly and marked approximations where she wasn't certain word for word. She noted the specific documents Voss had shown her, described their appearance, and recorded the name Arthur Penner exactly as Voss had spoken it. When she finished, Clara read it through once, then she slid it to Ethan. He read it, folded it, set it on top of Marsh's letters. "That's enough," he said. "Enough for what?" Dorothy asked. "Enough to show a territorial judge that Voss has been coordinating a campaign of pressure across multiple channels against the same party." Clara looked at her aunt. "In territorial law, that pattern matters. It's the difference between a creditor pursuing a legitimate claim and a man running a scheme. The statement puts Voss in the scheme." Dorothy absorbed this. "He made a mistake coming to me. He made the mistake of assuming family would create doubt rather than ammunition," Clara said. "He doesn't understand how we work." Dorothy looked at her niece for a long moment. Then she said with the directness that apparently ran in the Whitmore blood, "Do you love him?" The kitchen went very quiet. Clara did not look at Ethan. "That's not the relevant question right now, Aunt Dorothy." "It's the relevant question always," Dorothy said. "Everything else is paperwork." Ethan kept his expression neutral, which cost him slightly more than it usually did. Clara said, "I'll make up the spare room." Dorothy accepted this as the answer. It was gathered herself from the table and went to find the spare room without being shown where it was, because Dorothy Whitmore had never needed guidance to locate the things she wanted. The letter to Marsh went on the first stage the following morning, carrying Dorothy's statement, the certified copy from Alcott's office, and a 2-page summary from Clara, laying out the Penner connection and what it implied about Voss's strategy. Clara wrote that summary between 4 and 6 in the morning before anyone else was awake. Ethan found her at the table when he came down just before 6, the last page drying beside the lamp, her hair still pinned from the night before, and a coffee cup at her elbow that had gone cold. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You slept," he said. "Some." "Clara." "I know." She picked up the summary, tapped it against the table to align the pages. "I'll sleep when Marsh has everything he needs." He didn't argue with her. He'd known her long enough by now, 2 months, which felt both very short and strangely longer, to understand that she didn't run on the same fuel as most people. She ran on the clarity of having done what needed doing. Telling her to rest before a thing was finished was like telling a fire to wait. He made fresh coffee and put a cup in front of her without comment. She picked it up and kept working. He sat across from her and went over the cattle figures for the week, because work was the language they both spoke fluently, and sharing it in the same space in the early morning quiet had become something neither of them had discussed, but both of them had stopped being surprised by. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked across at him. "What happens if Marsh gets to Penner first, and Penner is already compromised?" she asked. "You mean if Voss has already paid him?" I mean, if this goes to a judge who's been told what to think before we say a word. Ethan had been thinking about this. Marsh knows the territorial circuit. He'll know Penner's record. If there's a conflict of interest, he can request a different judge. He paused. But that takes time. We may not have much time. If Voss moves to file before Marsh responds, Voss won't file without knowing whether his instrument holds, Ethan said. He doesn't take public legal action until he's certain of the outcome. That's his pattern. He's never been in a courtroom that I know of because he never lets it get that far. Clara considered this. He might not have a choice this time. No. Ethan met her eyes. He might not. She looked at him steadily. Then we need to be in the room when he runs out of them. Miem. Marsh arrived in Willow Creek 10 days later. Not a letter. The man himself. He came on the Wednesday stage, a compact man in his late 40s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a briefcase that looked like it had been to the territorial capital and back 100 times. He was not impressive at first glance, which Ethan suspected was deliberate. He came to the ranch directly. Ethan met him at the door, and they shook hands with the efficiency of men who have a lot of ground to cover. Clara had coffee on the table before Marsh sat down. I came in person, Marsh said, setting his briefcase on the table and opening it. Because what I'm about to tell you requires the kind of conversation that doesn't travel well in letters. He sorted papers, quickly found what he wanted, and looked up at both of them. The Penner connection is worse than you thought. Clara didn't move. Tell me, Arthur Penner is not just a territorial judge Voss knows. Penner's brother-in-law is a partner in the Missoula lending firm that holds your father's note. Marsh set a document on the table. Their family, by marriage, close in age, have worked in connected financial and legal circles in Missoula for 9 years. He paused. Voss didn't just suggest a sympathetic judge to your aunt. He told her about the judge who is personally invested in the outcome of this case. The weight of that landed across the table like something physical. That's a conflict of interest that disqualifies him outright, Clara said. More than that. Marsh leaned forward. If we can show that Voss steered this case toward a judge he knew had a familial financial interest in one party, and that Penner intended to hear it anyway without disclosing the relationship, that's not just a conflict. That's coordination, potentially collusion. He looked between them. That's the kind of thing that gets a judge removed from the territorial bench. Ethan said, How solid is the family connection? Marriage records, county filings, business partnership documents. Marsh tapped the stack of papers. I have all of it. The Missoula County Recorder is more cooperative than your Voss apparently expected. Clara looked at Ethan. He looked at her. He overreached, she said. He got comfortable, Ethan said. He's been running this play for years, and no one's ever pushed back hard enough to make him careful. Until now, Marsh said with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time to say those two words in that order. The hearing was set for October 14th, not Penner, a senior territorial judge named Caldwell out of Helena, who had a 30-year record that Marsh described as clean as anyone's got in this territory, which in Marsh's language amounted to a glowing endorsement. Voss was notified through legal channels. His response came back through his own lawyer, a man named Fremont, also out of Missoula, who was smoother in correspondence than in person, and had conceded nothing, while also not denying anything, which was the legal equivalent of a man backing slowly toward the door. Fremont asked for a postponement. Marsh declined. Fremont asked for additional discovery time. Marsh declined, citing the documented pattern of pressure against his clients as justification for expedited hearing. Caldwell agreed. October 14th held. When Ethan read Marsh's letter confirming the date, he read it at the kitchen table with Clara across from him and Dorothy at the stove, because Dorothy had stayed, which no one had explicitly invited, and no one had explicitly objected to. And in the 2 weeks she had been there, she had made herself quietly indispensable in the way that certain older women do. Feeding people, asking sharp questions, noticing things, and saying what she thought without particular concern for whether it was convenient. What happens at the hearing? Dorothy asked without turning from the stove. Marsh presents the recording defect on the note, Clara said. The statute violation. The evidence of the Penner relationship. Voss has to either defend the note and explain the filing delay or release it. And if he tries to fight it, then the Penner material becomes part of the record, Clara said. And that's a problem for Voss that goes well beyond this case. Dorothy turned. He'll release it. Marsh thinks so too, Ethan said. Dorothy nodded once with the finality of someone crossing something off a list and turned back to the stove. Ethan looked at Clara. She looked back. In her eyes was something that was not quite peace, not yet, but the closest thing to it that either of them had allowed themselves. 4 days before the hearing, Charles Whitaker came to the ranch. He didn't send word ahead. He rode up in the mid-afternoon and Ethan met him in the yard with the particular stillness of a man who has already decided how this conversation will go before it starts. Whitaker dismounted. He looked at Ethan without the social confidence he usually carried. I need to talk to you, Whitaker said. You're talking, Ethan said. Whitaker took a breath. I think I've been used. You have been. A pause. Whatever response Whitaker had prepared for that directness wasn't it. He reset. Voss came to me 2 months ago, he said. He told me your wife was in a vulnerable situation. He suggested that He stopped. That if I were in a position to offer her a better arrangement, the social circumstances might be such that... He told you she might be available, Ethan said. Whitaker's jaw tightened. He implied it. And you believed him because it was what you wanted to hear. No answer. What do you want from me, Whitaker? Whitaker looked at the ground for a moment, then up. I want to tell you what he said to me. All of it. The specific things. He met Ethan's eyes. Because I think it would be useful to your lawyer. Ethan studied the man across from him. He was not fond of Charles Whitaker. Had never been fond of him, not from personal animosity, just from the assessment of a man who'd watched him operate for years and found the operating unremarkable in its self-interest. But what he was looking at now was something different. A man who had made a mistake knew it and was here to own it in the only way that cost him anything. Come inside, Ethan said. Whitaker's account took 45 minutes. Clara listened without interrupting. Dorothy sat in the corner and listened without speaking, which was a remarkable display of self-control from a woman who had opinions about everything. Ethan sat at the table and let Whitaker talk, watching his face, checking his account against everything they already knew. It fit. It filled gaps. It was the kind of testimony that worked not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific dates, conversations, the particular phrases Voss had used, the sequence of suggestions that had steered Whitaker in the direction Voss wanted him to go. When Whitaker finished, Clara said, You understand that what you've described confirms a deliberate pattern of coordination, not just opportunism. Yes. Whitaker's voice was flat. I understand. And you're willing to write this down and sign it. I'm here, aren't I? He said it without aggression. Just the plain acknowledgement of a man who had already decided. Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan said, Get him paper. Clara got the paper. Whitaker wrote. When he left an hour later, the signed statement went into the folder with Dorothy's, with Alcott's documentation, with Marsh's analysis. The folder was thick now. It had weight to it, the satisfying weight of a case that had been built piece by piece until it became something no one could dismiss. Dorothy looked at the folder after Whitaker's horse disappeared down the road. He rode all the way out here to do that, she said. Yes, Clara said. That took something. It did. Dorothy nodded slowly. Voss is the kind of man who relies on people not being willing to do the hard thing. She looked at her niece. He picked the wrong county. The rain came on October 11th, 3 days before the hearing. 3 weeks after the drought had pushed everything to the edge of what was manageable. It came at night slow at first, Then steady, the kind of rain that doesn't perform, that just arrives and does what it came to do. Ethan woke when he heard it on the roof and lay still for a moment listening. Then he got up and stood at the window. Clara appeared in the doorway behind him. She didn't say anything. She came to stand beside him, and they both listened to the rain, and the relief that moved through the house was almost physical. The particular relief of something that has been uncertain for a long time, finally resolving in the right direction. "The North Creek will come back up," Ethan said. "I know." "We won't need to sell any more of the herd." "I know." He looked at her in the dark. She was looking at the window. Something had been building between them for weeks. Not dramatically, not in the way stories usually told it, but in the quiet, accumulative way of two people who have been in the same room through enough hard things to understand each other at a level that most people never reached. He had watched her think. He had watched her absorb setbacks and reorganize and keep moving. He had watched her be patient with Dorothy, firm, with Whitaker, relentless with the accounts. And once, just once, when she didn't know he was nearby, he had watched her stand at the edge of the property in the early morning, with her eyes closed and her hands loose at her sides, just breathing, just allowing herself a moment of something that wasn't managing anything. He had thought about that moment more times than he would ever tell her. "Clara," he said. She turned, in the dark with the rain coming down steady on the roof of the house they'd been building a life in, without either of them saying that's what they were doing. He looked at her and did not find any of the words he'd spent 12 years being certain he would never say again. What came out instead was, "I'm glad you rode out here." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "So am I." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a scene. It was just the truth said quietly in the dark with the rain as a witness. But it was real. And real, Ethan was beginning to remember, was better than everything else. October 14th arrived cold and clear. They rode into Willow Creek together. Ethan and Clara with Dorothy in the buckboard behind them, because Dorothy had announced she was attending and nobody had thought seriously about arguing. Marsh met them outside the courthouse at 8 in the morning, briefcase in hand already, with the focus of a man who had been awake thinking about this since before dawn. He shook Ethan's hand. He looked at Clara. "How are you?" he asked. "Ready?" she said. He nodded like that was the only answer that mattered. "Voss is here. He came with Fremont and 2 other men I don't recognize. One of them is taking notes, which suggests he's hedging toward a settlement offer." "Will Caldwell accept a last-minute settlement?" Ethan asked. "If we agree to it, it's our choice." Marsh looked at Clara. "If Voss offers to release the note voluntarily before we present, it's a clean resolution. No record of wrongdoing, no public finding. He walks away. You walk away with the debt cleared." Clara was quiet. "What would you advise?" she asked. Marsh adjusted his glasses. "Legally, the settlement resolves your immediate situation entirely. There's nothing more you need from this proceeding, technically speaking." He paused. "The rest of it, the Penner material, the coordinated pressure campaign, the misuse of Whitaker and your aunt, that's a different case for a different day, with different parties. You can't force that outcome here regardless of what happens this morning." "But the record of this hearing becomes public," Clara said. "If we go forward, yes." She looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. He didn't tell her what to decide. It wasn't his call to make for her, and they both knew it. "What does Voss think we'll do?" she asked Marsh. "He thinks you'll take the settlement. Every other target he's approached has taken the settlement." Clara turned toward the courthouse door. "Then let's go inside," she said. The courtroom was small and cold, and smelled of pine and old paper. Caldecott was already on the bench, a man of 60, with a face that had made up its mind about things decades ago, and was not interested in revisiting the decisions. He looked at the assembled parties with the equanimity of someone who had seen every version of human maneuvering that money could produce, and was not particularly impressed by any of it. Voss sat at the opposing table with Fremont and his 2 associates. He looked for the first time since this began like a man who understood his situation. Not frightened. Men like Voss didn't frighten easily, but contained, careful. The smile was still there, but it had turned inward, as if he was working something out. He looked at Clara when she sat down. She looked back. She didn't look away. Something shifted in his face so briefly that most people would have missed it. Ethan didn't miss it. It was the recognition of a man who had underestimated something and was now revising the estimate too late to change the outcome. Caldecott called the proceedings to order. Fremont stood immediately. "Your Honor, before we begin, my client wishes to convey a proposed resolution." "Sit down, Mr. Fremont," Caldecott said without particular emphasis. "We'll proceed in order." Fremont sat down. Marsh stood. He presented the recording defect, first clean documented statutory, Alcott's certification, the filing date, the territorial precedent. He spoke for 11 minutes and used exactly as many words as the case required, and no more. When he finished, Caldecott looked at Fremont. Response. Fremont stood. He spoke for 7 minutes. He argued administrative oversight, good faith industry practice in recording transfers. He was polished. He had clearly prepared thoroughly. He was also, Ethan could see from watching Caldecott's face, not making headway. Caldecott looked at the documentation. He asked 3 questions of Marsh, who answered each one directly. He asked 1 question of Fremont, who answered at length, which was itself an answer of a kind. Then Caldecott looked at Harlan Voss. "Mr. Voss," he said, "you are personally familiar with the instrument in question." Voss stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you were aware of the transfer of this note and the associated filing requirements." A pause, brief, almost imperceptible. "The details of the filing were managed by my firm's administrative staff," Voss said. "I see." Caldecott looked down at the papers. "Mr. Marsh, you have additional documentation." "I do, Your Honor." Marsh produced the folder, Dorothy's statement, Whitaker's statement, the Penner family connection documents. He laid them on the court's table one by one. Fremont was on his feet. "Your Honor, those materials are outside the scope of... They speak to a pattern of conduct relevant to this court's assessment of the instrument's legitimacy and the circumstances of its enforcement," Marsh said without raising his voice. "The court is entitled to understand the context in which a legal instrument was wielded." Caldecott held up one hand. Fremont stopped. Caldecott read. The courtroom was completely silent. He read Dorothy's statement. He read Whitaker's. He reviewed the Penner documentation and the family connection with the Missoula firm. He read carefully, without rushing, with the attention of a man who understood exactly what he was holding. When he looked up, his face had not changed. But something in the room had. Voss was very still. Fremont was looking at his table. Caldecott said, "Mr. Fremont, I'll hear that proposed resolution now." The resolution took 22 minutes to formalize. Voss released the note in its entirety with no remaining obligation. Clara signed nothing that acknowledged the debt's validity. The instrument was voided by the court on the grounds of the recording defect, with a notation in the record that the court had reviewed additional material speaking to the conduct of enforcement. That notation was small. 3 sentences. But it was public record, and it would follow Harlan Voss across every territorial county that shared courthouse records with Willow Creek. Fremont tried to get the notation removed. Caldecott declined. Outside the courthouse on the wooden steps in the cold October air, Marsh shook their hands and said, "That went about as well as it could have." Dorothy said, "It went exactly as it should have." Marsh smiled at that. Clara stood beside Ethan and breathed in the cold air, and did not cry, which Ethan had never expected she would. She closed her eyes for just a second. That was all. Then she opened them, and the brightness in her face was not performance. It was the real thing moving through her too fast to contain. She looked at Ethan. He looked at her. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She nodded once, and then, without planning it, without either of them making a decision about it, she reached out and took his hand. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small, quiet, entirely natural thing. The kind of thing that happens when a person reaches for something they've been wanting to reach for a long time and simply stops finding reasons not to. Ethan looked down at their hands. He did not pull away. He held on. And standing on the courthouse steps in Willow Creek on a cold October morning, after everything that had been built and fought for and quietly carefully grown, the lonely cowboy who had stopped believing in things that lasted, held the hand of the woman who had ridden 7 miles through the dust to find him, and held it like he meant to keep it. Dorothy looked at them both. She said nothing. She turned and walked toward the buckboard with the satisfied expression of a woman whose questions had all been answered. Behind them, the courthouse door opened, and Harlan Voss walked out. He stopped when he saw them. Ethan felt Clara's hand tighten slightly in his. He didn't look at Voss. He kept looking at her. After a moment, Voss walked past them down the steps and to his horse, and rode away without a word. The October wind moved through the street. Willow Creek went on about its morning, and the two of them stood there a while longer, not because they had to, but because neither of them was in any hurry to let go. Dorothy left on a Thursday. She packed her 2 bags with the same efficiency she'd brought to everything else, came downstairs, set them by the door, and stood in the kitchen looking at Clara with an expression that had been carefully arranged to appear neutral and was not succeeding particularly well. "You'll write," Dorothy said. "Every week," Clara said. "Not every 2 weeks, every week." "Every week, Aunt Dorothy." Dorothy looked at Ethan. She had been looking at him differently for the past 2 weeks, since the courthouse, since she had watched him hold her niece's hand on those steps and not let go until Clara was ready to move. She looked at him the way a woman looks at something she had been uncertain about and has recently decided to trust. "You'll take care of her," Dorothy said. It was not a question. "She doesn't need taking care of," Ethan said, "but I'll be here." Dorothy considered this answer for a moment. Then she nodded once with the precision of someone filing a document. "That's the right answer," she said. She hugged Clara for a long time. She shook Ethan's hand with a firmness that communicated more than most speeches could. She picked up her bags, walked out to the buckboard, and did not look back, because Dorothy Whitmore was the kind of woman who made her goodbyes inside the house and kept her composure on the road. They watched her go from the porch. When the buckboard turned onto the main road and disappeared behind the tree line, Clara let out a breath she had apparently been holding for some time. "She loves you," Ethan said. "She's terrifying," Clara said. "Both things are true." Clara looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the same neighborhood. They went inside. The store reopened the following Monday with full-stock clean windows and regular hours posted on a new sign above the door that Clara had arranged through the carpenter in town. She had spent the 2 weeks since the hearing doing exactly what she had promised, not managing the store like something fragile, but running it like something healthy. She rehired the 2 clerks her father had employed before the trouble started. She ordered new inventory from the Helena supplier she had used for 3 years. She updated the accounts so that every transaction was clear and current, and she sent a brief professional letter to each of her 2 remaining local creditors, the ones who had always been reasonable, explaining that the debt situation was resolved and that she intended to continue doing business with them for a long time. Both wrote back within the week. Both said they were glad to hear it. Ethan helped her carry boxes on the reopening morning, which was not something that would normally fall within the scope of a cattleman's responsibilities. He didn't mention this. She didn't either. He carried boxes and she organized shelves, and they worked in the same silence they had learned in the kitchen, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The first customer through the door was Frank Purdy, Ethan's neighbor, who had noticed the new sign and came in for tobacco and coffee beans, and stayed for 20 minutes talking to Clara about nothing in particular, with the ease of a man who had decided some time ago which way he was leaning on this situation. The second customer was Margaret Hale. She came in mid-morning when Clara was behind the counter alone. She looked at the reorganized shelves and the restocked inventory and the new ledger system visible on the counter, and she said nothing about any of it. She bought 2 bolts of fabric and a set of buttons. She counted out the correct payment and set it on the counter. Then she said, "I heard the hearing went well." "It did," Clara said. A pause. Margaret Hale was not a woman who apologized easily. She had a social code built over 30 years in a small town, and it did not include a specific entry for this particular moment. What she said instead was, "Your husband is a good man." "I know," Clara said. "I may have been slow to see that." "You weren't alone in it," Clara said without heat. "Just the fact." Margaret Hale picked up her package. "The women's circle meets on Thursdays, if you'd like to come." She said it the way you say something, when you mean more than the words themselves can carry. "You'd be welcome." Clara looked at her. "I'll think about it." It was not yes, but it was not no. And Margaret Hale, who understood the social language of Willow Creek better than anyone, heard exactly what it was. She nodded. She left. Clara stood behind the counter for a moment after the door closed. Then she wrote the transaction in the ledger, straightened the bolts of remaining fabric, and went back to work. What nobody had expected. Not Ethan, not Clara, not even Marsh, who had seen the resolution coming more clearly than anyone, was what happened 3 weeks after the hearing with Harlan Voss. Marsh wrote to them on a Tuesday. His letter was short. Voss had left the territory, not quietly and not entirely by choice. The notation in Caldicott's court record had circulated faster than anyone anticipated because George Alcott was a man who took his responsibilities seriously and had shared the relevant filing information with his counterpart recorders in 2 neighboring counties as a professional courtesy. Those recorders had their own relationships with their own judges. And those judges, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this kind of documented pattern for a long time. 2 other cases had surfaced. 2 other parties in other counties who had been run through the same sequence Voss had used on Clara: the acquired debt, the pressure campaign, the suggestion of a sympathetic judge, the offer of settlement that was really the transfer of something valuable at distressed terms. Both cases were now under review. One of them involved a widow who had lost her family's grain operation 18 months earlier in what she had believed at the time was simply bad luck. Voss's lawyer Fremont had reached out to Marsh with a message that amounted to a request to manage the situation quietly. Marsh had declined on behalf of his clients because his clients had not asked him to manage anything quietly. Voss was gone to Oregon or California or somewhere that was not Montana territory, and the general opinion among the people who tracked such movements was that he would be considerably more careful in whatever territory he settled next. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table. Clara was across from him. She had read it first and passed it to him without speaking. When he finished, he set it down. She was looking at the window. "The widow," she said. "The one with the grain operation." "I know. She lost everything." "I know." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That could have been me. 8 months ago, before I knew about the filing defect, before we had Marsh, that was exactly where I was headed." "But it wasn't you," Ethan said. "It was someone." She looked at him. "It was someone who didn't have the right information or the right timing or the right—" She stopped. "The right husband," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The word sat between them differently than it had before. Not the word of a legal arrangement, not the word of a partnership with defined terms, but the word as it actually was, between 2 people who had been through something together and come out the other side, still wanting to be in the same room. "I'm going to write to her," Clara said. "To the widow. I want her to know what happened. I want her to know about the filing statute about Marsh, about what Caldecott put on the record." She met his eyes. "She deserves to know she wasn't foolish. She was targeted. Marsh can help with that. I'll ask him." She reached across the table and picked up the letter again. "And I'm going to ask him about the other cases. Whether there's something that can be done. Whether there are other people who need to know what we found." Ethan looked at her. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead, the way she always did, that particular quality she had of turning the finish of one thing directly into the starting point of another. He had loved that about her, before he'd known he loved anything about her. The thought arrived with no announcement and no drama, the way his most certain thoughts always did. He loved her, not because she had ridden 7 miles and said something impossible in his yard, not because she was the most admired woman in Willow Creek, not because of any of the parts of her that the town could see. He loved her because she was sitting at his kitchen table, reading a letter about a widow she had never met, and was already constructing a plan to help her. Because she did that the same way she did everything without waiting for someone else to decide, it mattered, without asking whether it was convenient. Because in 2 months, he had watched her be afraid exactly 0 times, and sad twice. And those 2 times, she had not hidden it or asked for rescue, just let it exist for a moment and then moved forward. He had been alone for 12 years. He had believed with the conviction of a man who has been burned badly enough to mean it that wanting things that lasted was a liability he could not afford. Sitting across from Clara Whitmore Caldwell on a November morning, with Voss's retreat on the table between them, he understood clearly and without self-pity that he had been wrong about that. He had not been protecting himself. He had been waiting. He hadn't known that until now. "Clara," he said. She looked up from the letter. He had not planned this. There was nothing prepared, no language he'd worked out in advance, because he was not that kind of man, and this was not that kind of moment. What it was real, and real didn't wait for preparation. "I need to say something to you," he said. She set the letter down. She gave him her full attention the way she always did, completely without fraction, as if whatever he was about to say was the only thing in the room. "When you came to me," he said, "you told me you'd watched how I treated people when I thought no one cared, that it told you more about me than anything else." He paused. "I've been thinking about that, because the same thing is true in the other direction." She didn't move. "I've watched you every day for 2 months," he said. "I've watched you work and think and fight for something that was yours and then turn around and think about how to help someone you've never met. I've watched you be honest when it would have been easier not to be, and I've watched you hold things together when any reasonable person would have let them fall apart." He looked at her across the table. "I didn't come into this expecting anything. You were clear about what the terms were, and I accepted them because they were fair and because I believed you." "Ethan, let me finish." He kept his voice even. "The terms were fair, but they weren't what happened." He held her eyes. "What happened is, I'm in love with you. And I'm not saying that to change the arrangement or to ask you for anything. I'm saying it because I told you on day 1 that this has to stay honest or it doesn't work at all, and me not saying this would be the least honest thing I've done in 12 years. The kitchen was absolutely still. Clara looked at him. Her expression was doing something he had not seen before. Not the composure she wore over everything, not the sharpness she brought to problems, not the careful openness of someone managing their own feelings. Something underneath all of that. Something that had been there for a while, he suspected, waiting for the door to open. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that you're in love with me." "Yes." "And you're not asking me for anything in return." "I'm not asking you for anything you don't want to give." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you know how long it has been since someone told me the truth without needing something from me for it?" He didn't answer because it wasn't a question she needed him to answer. "I came to you with a transaction," she said. "That was real. I meant every word of it. I was not being dishonest with you." She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up. "But I was also not entirely telling myself the truth. About why your name was first on the list. About why it was the only name I was actually seriously considering." She paused. "There were other men with land and standing. There were other men who might have agreed to the arrangement. I didn't go to them." "Clara?" "I came to you," she said, "because from 3 years of watching, I already knew I would rather spend difficult times with you than comfortable times with anyone else. I told myself it was pragmatic. I told myself it was about character." She held his gaze steadily. "It was also just that I wanted it to be you. And I wasn't ready to say that out loud until you just did." The November light came through the kitchen window, and fell across the old pine table and the letter about Harlan Voss's retreat and the 2 coffee cups that had been a feature of this kitchen for 2 months now. Ethan stood up. He came around the table. He put his hand out. She took it. He pulled her to her feet, and she came without resistance, and when she was standing in front of him, she looked up at him with an expression that was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen on her face. All of the composure set down, all of the management released, just Clara, just the real version of her that she had always been underneath the capable, relentless, extraordinary person the world saw. He kissed her. Not tentatively, not like a question, like a man who has finally come home to a place he didn't know he'd been looking for. She kissed him back the same way. The wedding celebration was held on the 15th of November. Clara organized it, which meant it was exactly what it needed to be and nothing it didn't. She rented the meeting hall from the Methodists, who agreed readily because Reverend Calloway had been following the events of the past months with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believes things generally work out right when people behave correctly. She arranged food through the women who had been regulars at her father's store for 20 years. She ordered flowers from a woman in town who grew them under glass and was pleased to have the business in November. She did not make it large, she made it real. About 60 people came. Frank Purdy and his wife. George Alcott, who arrived early and stood near the wall with a glass of cider and the expression of a man who has done something small and right. Theodore Marsh came from Helena for it, which nobody had asked him to do, because he had apparently decided he wanted to see how the story ended. He stood with Dorothy, who had come back from Billings without being asked, and arrived on the Wednesday stage looking as if she had never left. Margaret Hale came. She brought her husband, who shook Ethan's hand with genuine warmth. She had been to the Thursday circle meeting twice with Clara by then, and whatever had shifted between them had shifted quietly and held. Billy Patterson came with his father Tom, whose missing fingers had healed in the way such things do, imperfectly, but functionally, the way most real healing goes. Billy was 13 now, and had grown 2 inches since winter, and still apparently thought about hammering nails, because the first thing he said to Ethan was that he had helped his father build a new chicken coop, and every nail had gone in straight. Ethan told him that was the correct outcome of practice. Billy looked profoundly satisfied. Charles Whitaker did not come. He had sent a note 2 weeks before, brief, formal, correctly phrased, expressing his good wishes for the occasion. Ethan read it once and set it aside without comment. Clara read it and said, "He means it," which was a more generous reading than Ethan had arrived at, but probably more accurate. The store was doing well by then, better than well. Clara had handled the reopening with the same systematic precision she applied to everything. And the result was what happened when someone who genuinely understands accounts and inventory and human relationship runs something without the weight of crisis pressing down on every decision. The 2 remaining creditors had both been paid on schedule. The books were current. The store was, for the first time since Thomas Whitmore's health had started failing, exactly what it had always been meant to be: steady, honest, and open. The widow in the other county had written back. Her name was Ruth Callahan, and she was 43 years old, and had lost her grain operation to what she had always privately suspected was not simply bad luck, but had never had the tools to prove. Clara's letter had reached her at the moment when she had nearly finished deciding that fighting was not worth the cost. She had written back 4 pages. Marsh was now working her case. Ethan had no prediction about the outcome, but he had a prediction about Ruth Callahan based on what Clara had told him from the letters. She would not give up. She was that kind of person. He was beginning to recognize the kind. At the celebration, about an hour in, Reverend Calloway said a few words. They were not a formal ceremony. They were already married legally and thoroughly, with Caldecott's court record attached and everything. What Calloway offered was something else. A acknowledgement. A blessing if you believed in that. A witnessing if you didn't. He talked about what he had seen in the months since Clara had ridden out to the Caldwell ranch on a summer afternoon. He talked about it the way a man talks when he is not trying to make a speech, but is simply telling the truth about what he observed. He said he had watched two people who had each decided for different reasons that needing someone was a risk they couldn't afford. He said he had watched that decision get revised, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary ones. Shared work, shared difficulty, shared mornings at a kitchen table with coffee and accounts, and the particular quiet of people who trust each other. He said, "The loneliest man in this county did not become less lonely because a beautiful woman chose him. He became less lonely because he chose to let himself be chosen. There's a difference. The first is luck. The second is courage." He looked at Ethan when he said that. Ethan held his gaze. He did not disagree. Dorothy, standing near the side wall, made a sound that she would have described as a cough, and that everyone in earshot correctly identified as something else. Later, when the celebration had quieted, and most people had eaten, and the conversations had broken into the smaller, warmer kind that happen when people stop performing and start just talking, Clara found Ethan standing near the door. He was watching the room. Not the way he used to watch rooms from the outside, deciding whether to engage. Watching it the way a person watches something they belong to. She came to stand beside him. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "I believe Reverend Calloway called you courageous. He was being generous." "I don't think he was." She looked at him. "You agreed to something you had no reason to trust. On 24 hours' notice with no guarantees from a woman you'd spoken 12 words to." She paused. "That's not a calculated decision. That's trust before the evidence was in." He looked at her. "You weren't a risk I was afraid of." "No. I was afraid of wanting it and losing it." He said it plainly. "That's different. You were—" He thought about how to say it accurately. "You were the clearest thing I'd seen in a long time. You rode up that road, and you said the most impossible thing I'd ever heard, and every part of you was completely present when you said it. No performance, no strategy." He shook his head slightly. "I didn't know what you wanted yet, but I knew exactly who you were. That's not something you walk away from." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You knew who I was," she said quietly, "after 20 minutes at a kitchen table." "After 3 years of watching someone not know I was watching," he said. The kitchen table was just the confirmation. She was quiet. Something moved through her face. Not the controlled expressions she'd worn through the hard months, not the brightness of the courthouse steps, but something deeper and steadier than either. The kind of feeling that doesn't perform itself because it doesn't need to. "I have something to tell you," she said. He waited. "When I made my list," she said, "the list of honest men in this county, it wasn't 3 names, it wasn't even 5. She met his eyes. "It was 1. It was always only 1. I made it a list so it would feel like a rational process." The corner of her mouth moved. "It was not a rational process." Ethan looked at her. "You rode 7 miles, he said, through the summer heat alone to tell me you'd narrowed it down to 1. "I rode 7 miles, she confirmed. "Through the summer heat alone, because I was not willing to spend the rest of my life watching a good man disappear into that ranch without at least asking the question." He reached out and took her hand. She laced her fingers through his. They stood there together in the warmth of the room with 60 people, and Frank Purdy and Dorothy and young Billy Patterson, and a man from Helena who'd come all this way to see how the story ended, all of it surrounding them, without intruding the way the world sometimes gets the proportion right and holds back far enough to let a real moment be what it is. All. The next morning they were up before the sun. Not because there was a crisis. Not because something needed managing. Because that was what they were, both of them, and the world they'd built together ran on early mornings and honest work and coffee at the old pine table before the light came up. Ethan was checking the north line when Clara brought out his jacket without being asked, because the temperature had dropped in the night, and she had noticed what he hadn't thought to think about yet. He put it on, and she went back inside, and he stood for a moment with the cold air on his face, and the North Creek running full and clear in the near distance, all the way back to where it should be, every inch of what the drought had taken, returned by the November rains. He had been on this land for 12 years. He had worked it alone and built it honestly and told himself the quiet was enough. It had not been enough. He had simply not known until now what enough actually felt like. It felt like this: a jacket that appeared when you needed it, a light in the kitchen window you could see from the pasture, a woman inside who had ridden 7 miles to find him and had not for a single day since given him reason to doubt that she meant exactly what she said. He went back inside. Clara was at the table working. She looked up when he came through the door. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was glad about, direct unperformed the way she did everything. "North line?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Creek's holding." She nodded. She poured him coffee. She went back to her work. He sat down across from her. They worked in the morning quiet the way they had learned to do together, separate in the same space, in the same life that had been built not from the perfect moment or the grand declaration, but from two people who had been honest with each other from the beginning and had not stopped. Outside, November light came up slow and gold over the Bitterroot Valley. The ranch that had known only one voice for 12 years held two. Now, and the quiet between them was not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of fullness, the particular peace of a home where people know each other truly, where nothing needs to be performed and nothing important goes unsaid. Ethan Caldwell had stopped believing in things that lasted. He had been wrong. And in the morning light of that November kitchen with Clara across the table and the North Creek running full, and the life they had built together surrounding them on every side, he knew with the same certainty he brought to honest work and kept promises and things worth holding on to, that he would never make that mistake again.